At 2:23 in the afternoon on April 7, 1945, the largest battleship ever built capsized and died. As the Yamato rolled to port beyond the point of return, her massive 18-inch gun turrets tore loose from their moorings and plunged into the sea. Swimming crewmen were dragged back toward the ship by the suction of her death throes. When the roll reached approximately 120 degrees, one of the forward magazines exploded in a blast so powerful that the mushroom cloud rose 6 kilometers into the sky and could be seen from Kyushu over 160 kilometers away. Of the 332 men aboard, only 277 would survive. The rest went down with the ship, some trapped inside compartments as water rushed in. Others sucked beneath the waves as she capsized, and many simply killed by the magazine explosion that tore the ship apart. The Yamato had been at sea for less than 36 hours on her final voyage, a suicide mission with no possibility of return. She had been ordered to beach herself on Okinawa and fight as an unsinkable gun emplacement until she was destroyed. She never came close. American carrier aircraft found her south of Kyushu and sent her to the bottom in less than 2 hours of sustained attack. The death of the Yamato was not merely the destruction of one ship. It was the final definitive proof that the age of the battleship was over, that naval power now belonged to aircraft carriers, and that Japan had lost the war. This is the story of how Japan built the mightiest battleship in history, only to watch it become obsolete before it ever fired its guns in the battle for which it was designed, and how the dream of naval supremacy died in the waters south of Kyushu on an April afternoon. To understand why Japan built the Yamato, we must understand the strategic dilemma facing Japanese naval planners in the 1930s. Japan was an island nation dependent on imported resources, particularly oil, iron, and food. Control of the sea lanes was not merely desirable, but essential to survival. The primary threat to Japanese interests in the Pacific was the United States Navy, which was larger, better funded, and backed by an industrial capacity that dwarfed Japan's. American shipyards could build vessels faster than Japanese yards. American factories could produce steel and weapons in quantities Japan could not match. The numbers were stark and undeniable. The United States produced 35% of the world's industrial output, while Japan produced just 3.5%. In a prolonged war of attrition, Japan would lose simply by being outbuilt. Japanese naval strategists understood this reality perfectly, and their response was ingenious in concept, if ultimately futile in execution. If Japan could not match American quantity, it would pursue quality. The Imperial Japanese Navy would build individual warships so powerful, so heavily armored, so devastatingly armed, that each one could engage multiple American battleships simultaneously and win. The plan was to achieve a decisive battle, a single cataclysmic naval engagement in which the Japanese fleet would destroy the American Pacific Fleet, forcing the United States to negotiate peace rather than continue a costly war. This strategy had worked before. In 1905, at the Battle of Tsushima, during the Russo-Japanese War, Admiral Togo had annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet in what remains one of the most complete naval victories in history. Japanese planners believed they could repeat this triumph against the Americans. All they needed was the right weapon. That weapon would be the Yamato-class battleship. In 1934, Japan withdrew from the League of Nations and renounced the Washington Naval Treaty, which had limited the size and armament of capital ships. Freed from these restrictions, Japanese naval architects began designing the largest, most powerful battleship ever conceived. The specifications were extraordinary. The ship would displace 72,000 tons at full load, more than any battleship afloat. It would be armoured so heavily that no existing naval gun could penetrate its vital areas. And it would be armed with 9 18-inch guns, the largest ever mounted on a warship. These guns could fire armour-piercing shells, weighing over 3,000 pounds, to a range of 42 kilometres. Each gun barrel was more than 20 meters long and weighed 147 tons. The turrets that housed these guns weighed more than most destroyers. When Yamato fired a full broadside from all 9 guns, the shockwave could kill anyone standing on the deck without protection. The ship was designed to be invincible, and in terms of its raw power, it nearly was. Construction began on November 4, 1937, at the Kure Naval Arsenal in Hiroshima. The secrecy surrounding the project was absolute. The construction dock was deepened by 1 meter to accommodate the enormous hull. Gantry cranes capable of lifting 350 tons were installed. A massive canopy was erected over part of the dry dock to screen the ship from aerial observation. Workers were forbidden from discussing what they were building. Photographers were not allowed near the site. Even within the Japanese military, only a handful of officers knew the true specifications of the ship under construction. The Japanese were determined that American intelligence would not learn about the Yamato until it was too late. On August 8, 1940, the Yamato was launched, her hull sliding into the water for the first time. Over the following 16 months, the ship was fitted out engines, installed armor plate welded into place, guns mounted, electronics fitted. On December 16, 1941, just 9 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Yamato was formally commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy. The ceremony was deliberately austere, another security measure to avoid drawing attention. The ship joined the 1st Battleship Division alongside the battleships Nagato and Mutsu. Within weeks, her sister ship Musashi would join her, equally massive and equally powerful. Japan now possessed the 2 most formidable warships ever built. Yet even as the Yamato entered service, the war that would determine her fate was revealing truths that Japanese naval strategists had not fully grasped. On December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft had struck Pearl Harbor and demonstrated the decisive power of naval aviation. On the same day, Japanese aircraft sank the British battleship Prince of Wales and battlecruiser Repulse off Malaya, proving that even modern, well-defended capital ships were vulnerable to air attack. These events should have been warnings. Instead, Japanese commanders clung to the belief that the decisive battle would still be fought by battleships. The Yamato was assigned as flagship of the combined fleet under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant strategist who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, but who understood better than most that Japan could not win a long war. Yamamoto was now planning the operation that would, he hoped, bring about the decisive engagement that would cripple American naval power and force a negotiated peace. That operation was the attack on Midway Island in June 1942. Yamamoto's plan was complex and ambitious. A diversionary force would attack the Aleutian Islands to draw American attention north. Meanwhile, a powerful carrier strike force would attack Midway, a critical American base in the Central Pacific. Yamamoto correctly assumed the Americans would respond by sending their remaining carriers to defend Midway. When they did, the Japanese would ambush and destroy them. And if the American battleships sortied from Pearl Harbor to support their carriers, Yamamoto's main battleship force, including Yamato, would engage and destroy them in the surface battle for which Japanese battleships had been designed. Yamamoto directed the entire operation from Yamato's flag bridge. But the plan unraveled within hours of execution. American codebreakers had intercepted and deciphered Japanese communications, so the Americans knew precisely when and where the attack would come. American carriers ambushed the Japanese carrier force instead of the other way around. On June 4, 1942, in the space of 5 minutes, American dive bombers struck 3 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi Kaga and Soryu, setting them ablaze. A 4th carrier, Hiryu, was sunk later that day. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers and over 300 aircraft. More importantly, Japan lost many of its most experienced carrier pilots, men who could not be replaced. The Battle of Midway was a catastrophic defeat that shifted the balance of naval power in the Pacific permanently in favor of the United States. And throughout the battle, Yamato never fired a shot. Yamamoto had dispersed his forces too widely in the hope of trapping the Americans. The battleship force, including Yamato, was too far from Midway to intervene when the carriers were being destroyed. By the time Yamamoto realized the extent of the disaster and ordered a general retreat, the battle was over. The ship built to win the decisive engagement had been a spectator to Japan's decisive defeat. For the next year and a half, the Yamato spent most of her time at the major Japanese naval base at Truk in the Caroline Islands. She was held in reserve waiting for the decisive battle that never came. This period would later be remembered with bitter irony by Japanese sailors, who nicknamed her Hotel Yamato because she remained safely at anchor while other ships fought and died at Guadalcanal, the Eastern Solomons, and the Santa Cruz Islands. The reason for this inactivity was partly practical. The Yamato consumed enormous quantities of fuel oil, Japan's scarcest resource. Her 18-inch guns had been designed for surface combat, and the Imperial Navy had not stockpiled ammunition suitable for shore bombardment. The waters around Guadalcanal and other contested islands were uncharted and dangerous for a ship with Yamato's deep draft. But the real reason was psychological. The Yamato had become too precious to risk. She was a symbol of Japanese naval power, and Japanese commanders were unwilling to commit her to action unless the perfect opportunity presented itself. That opportunity never came. While Yamato waited at Truk, the nature of naval warfare was changing irrevocably around her. American shipyards were producing Essex-class fleet carriers at a rate Japan could not match. American submarine warfare was decimating Japanese merchant shipping, strangling the flow of oil and resources that Japan needed to continue the war. And American forces were methodically advancing across the Pacific, seizing island bases and pushing closer to Japan itself. On December 25, 1943, the Yamato was finally blooded. While transporting troops and equipment from Yokosuka to Truk, her task group was intercepted by the American submarine USS Skate. The submarine fired 4 torpedoes. One struck Yamato on the starboard side toward the stern, ripping a hole 25 meters across and flooding the rear turret's magazine. The Yamato took on 3,000 tons of water but remained battle-worthy and reached Truk later that day. Temporary repairs were made by the repair ship Akashi, and on January 10, 1944, Yamato departed for Kure for permanent repairs. The damage was not severe, but the incident was psychologically significant. The Americans had found and hit the supposedly invincible battleship. Japanese sailors who had believed Yamato was unsinkable now knew she could be hurt. During repairs at Kure, additional armor was fitted in the damaged area, and the ship's anti-aircraft defenses were substantially upgraded. The original design had mounted 24 25mm anti-aircraft guns. By March 1944, that number had been increased to 162. The reasons for this dramatic increase were obvious to anyone paying attention. The threat to battleships was no longer other battleships. The threat was aircraft. In June 1944, the Yamato participated in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, which American pilots would mockingly call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese had assembled their remaining carrier strength in a desperate attempt to stop the American invasion of the Mariana Islands. The battle was a disaster for Japan. American fighters and anti-aircraft fire destroyed over 400 Japanese aircraft and sank 3 carriers including Taiho and Shokaku. Japanese pilots, hastily trained and inexperienced, were slaughtered by veteran American aviators flying superior aircraft. The Yamato's only significant contribution to the battle was accidentally opening fire on returning Japanese aircraft, mistaking them for American planes. The ship that was supposed to win the decisive battle was reduced to shooting at its own side in confusion. After the battle, the Yamato withdrew to linger in the Dutch East Indies, where major Japanese fleet units were now stationed to be near their dwindling fuel supplies. Japan's tanker fleet had been largely destroyed by American submarines, so it was no longer possible to base the fleet in Japan proper. The decision to station major warships in the East Indies, thousands of kilometers from the main theater of operations, was itself an admission of how desperate Japan's strategic situation had become. In October 1944, the Yamato finally got the chance to prove herself in surface combat. The Americans had invaded the Philippines at Leyte Gulf, and the Japanese response was Operation Shogo, a complex plan that called for multiple Japanese forces to converge on the American invasion fleet and destroy it. Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, which included Yamato and her sister Musashi, would transit the San Bernardino Strait and fall upon the American transports and landing craft. It was a desperate plan, but Japanese commanders believed it was their last opportunity to inflict a crippling blow on the Americans. On October 18th, Yamato was coated with black camouflage soot taken from her own smokestack in preparation for a nighttime transit of the strait. On October 23rd, while crossing the Palawan Passage, Kurita's force was attacked by American submarines that sank 2 heavy cruisers, including Kurita's flagship Atago. Kurita transferred his flag to Yamato and continued toward Leyte. The following day, October 24th, American carrier aircraft from Task Force 38 found and attacked Kurita's force in the Sibuyan Sea. Wave after wave of bombers and torpedo planes struck the Japanese ships. The Yamato was hit by 2 armor-piercing bombs and suffered a near miss. She took on over 3,000 tons of water but remained operational. Her sister ship Musashi was not so fortunate. American aircraft concentrated their attacks on Musashi, hitting her with 17 bombs and 19 torpedoes. The great battleship capsized and sank, taking over half her crew with her. It had taken 19 torpedo hits to sink Musashi, testament to the incredible toughness of the Yamato-class design. But the lesson was clear. No amount of armor could protect a battleship from determined, coordinated air attack. Kurita pressed on despite the losses. American Admiral William Halsey, believing Kurita's force had been crippled and was retreating, took his powerful Task Force 38 north in pursuit of a Japanese carrier force that was actually serving as a decoy. This left the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. During the night, Kurita's force, including Yamato, passed through the strait and emerged off Samar Island at dawn on October 25th. What happened next would become one of the most extraordinary naval engagements of the war. Kurita's force, expecting to attack undefended transports instead, encountered Task Unit 77.4.3, codenamed Taffy 3, a small group of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. Kurita mistook the small escort carriers for fleet carriers and believed he had stumbled into the main American carrier force. At 6:57 a.m. from a range of 35,000 yards, Yamato fired her first salvos in anger against enemy surface vessels. This was the moment she had been designed for the surface action that Japanese strategists had envisioned since the 1930s. For the next 2.5 hours, the battle off Samar raged. The American escorts, hopelessly outgunned, nevertheless attacked with suicidal courage. Destroyers charged Yamato and the other Japanese battleships, firing torpedoes and drawing fire away from the carriers. The destroyer USS Johnston, commanded by Commander Ernest Evans, made a torpedo run that damaged the heavy cruiser Kumano, then turned to engage Yamato herself. At 7:30 a.m., Yamato fired a full broadside at Johnston from 20,000 yards. 3 18-inch shells struck the destroyer along with 3 6-inch shells from Yamato's secondary battery. The damage was catastrophic. Johnston's bridge was shredded, killing most of the command staff and wounding Evans. 1 18-inch shell hit amidships, cutting the destroyer's speed in half. Johnston would sink later that morning, and Evans would posthumously receive the Medal of Honor for his courage. Yamato continued firing at the escort carriers. At 8:10 a.m., she scored a direct hit on USS Gambia Bay with an 18-inch shell that smashed through the carrier's hangar deck. At 8:20, another hit struck the carrier's engine room, below the waterline, cutting her speed and leaving her dead in the water. Yamato and other Japanese ships pounded Gambia Bay until she capsized and sank at 9:07 a.m. Yamato also engaged and helped sink the destroyer USS Hoel, scoring a critical hit that disabled the destroyer's last boiler. The Japanese were winning the surface action. They had sunk Gambia Bay and 3 escorts, and the rest of Taffy 3 was in desperate straits. But then Kurita made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Convinced by the ferocity of American resistance and the relentless air attacks which had sunk 3 Japanese heavy cruisers that he was facing a much larger force than he actually was, Kurita ordered a retreat. The Japanese turned away from the American transports they had been sent to destroy and withdrew back through the San Bernardino Strait. They had come within miles of achieving their objective, and they abandoned it at the moment of victory. During the retreat, Yamato was hit by 2 more bombs from aircraft off USS Hornet, but the damage was minor. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was over. Japan had lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships including Musashi, 10 cruisers, and numerous smaller vessels. The Imperial Japanese Navy as an organized fighting force had effectively ceased to exist. Yamato survived, but she had no fleet left to fight with. By early 1945, Japan's strategic situation was beyond desperate. American forces had captured the Philippines' Iwo Jima and were preparing to invade Okinawa, just 350 miles from the Japanese home islands. The Japanese merchant fleet had been virtually annihilated by American submarines. Oil stocks were nearly exhausted. Industrial production was collapsing under sustained American bombing. The Imperial Japanese Navy was reduced to a handful of warships that lacked fuel to operate. Yamato sat at Kure, her fuel tanks nearly empty, her purpose unclear. Some officers advocated using her as a stationary gun platform to defend the home islands. Others suggested removing her main guns and using them as coastal artillery. A few even proposed simply scuttling her to prevent her capture by American forces. In the end, the Japanese High Command chose a course of action that combined desperation with the samurai ethos of honorable death. Yamato would be sent on a one-way mission to Okinawa. She would be given just enough fuel to reach the island, but not enough to return. She would beach herself and fight as an unsinkable gun emplacement using her massive 18-inch guns to bombard American positions until she was destroyed. The crew would fight to the death. It was called Operation Tengo, and it was suicide dressed up as strategy. On March 29, 1945, Yamato took on her last load of ammunition. The ship's magazines were filled with shells, enough for a sustained bombardment of Okinawa, assuming she reached it. Officially, she was provided with only enough fuel for a one-way journey, but local base commanders, unwilling to send men to certain death without at least the theoretical possibility of return, issued additional fuel amounting to 60% of capacity. On April 6, 1945, at 3:20 p.m., Yamato departed Tokuyama with an escort of the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers. They had been designated the Surface Special Attack Force, the naval equivalent of the kamikaze aircraft that were crashing into American ships at Okinawa. As the ships navigated the Bungo Strait on the evening of April 6th, they were spotted by American submarines, USS Threadfin and USS Hackleback. Both submarines tracked the Japanese force and radioed its position, course, and speed to the main American carrier strike force. Neither submarine could attack because the Japanese ships were zigzagging at high speed, but their reports sealed Yamato's fate. The Americans knew exactly where she was and where she was going. At dawn on April 7th, Yamato's crew went to general quarters. They knew American aircraft would find them. The only question was when. At 8:23 a.m., the first American reconnaissance aircraft made contact. For the next 5 hours, flying boats shadowed the Japanese force, staying just out of range of Yamato's anti-aircraft guns. The crew could do nothing but watch and wait. At 10:30 a.m., radar picked up the first formations of attacking aircraft. At noon, American fighters appeared overhead to suppress any Japanese air cover. There was none. The Japanese no longer had aircraft or fuel to provide fighter protection. At 12:30 p.m., the sky filled with American planes. Task Force 58 had launched 280 bombers and torpedo bombers from multiple carriers. They came in coordinated waves, dive bombers attacking from high altitude, while torpedo bombers came in at sea level from multiple directions, simultaneously, a tactic designed to overwhelm the ship's defenses. At 12:37 p.m., the attacks began. The first wave scored hits quickly. At 12:41 p.m., a torpedo struck Yamato on the port side. 2 bombs destroyed anti-aircraft mounts and blew a hole in the deck. Another bomb destroyed the radar room. The ship took damage, but remained operational. Damage control parties flooded compartments on the starboard side to counter the list caused by the torpedo hit. This was standard practice, and it worked. The list was reduced to just 1 degree. But the Americans were just beginning. At 1:30 p.m., the second wave attacked. This time, the coordination was perfect. Dive bombers attacked from directly overhead, while torpedo bombers came in from all directions at once. Yamato's anti-aircraft guns fired desperately, but there were too many targets. The battleship's massive main guns were loaded with special anti-aircraft shells designed to explode in the air and create a cloud of shrapnel, but these were largely ineffective. 3 or 4 torpedoes hit the port side, and 1 struck starboard. The damage was severe. Fire rooms were flooded. Engine rooms began taking on water. The port list increased to 15 degrees, then 18. Counterflooding reduced it to 10 degrees, but the ship's speed dropped to 18 knots, and the list meant the main battery could no longer fire. Yamato was crippled, but still afloat. At 1:40 p.m., the third and most devastating wave struck. At least 4 more torpedoes slammed into the ship, 3 on the port side and 1 to starboard. The port inner engine room flooded. The steering gear room flooded. With the auxiliary steering room already underwater, Yamato lost the ability to steer and became locked in a starboard turn. 4 bombs hit the superstructure, causing heavy casualties among the anti-aircraft gun crews. Near misses drove in the outer hull plating, compromising the ship's torpedo defense system. Water was flooding into the ship faster than pumps could remove it. The port list increased past 20 degrees. At 2:02 p.m., the order was given to abandon ship. By this time, fires were raging throughout the ship. Yamato's speed had dropped to 10 knots. The list continued to increase inexorably. Warning lights on the bridge indicated critical temperatures in the forward main battery magazines. Protocol required flooding these magazines to prevent an explosion, but the pumping stations had been knocked out. There was nothing anyone could do. At 2:05 p.m., the cruiser Yahagi capsized and sank. At the same time, a final wave of American torpedo bombers attacked Yamato from the starboard side. The torpedoes set for a depth of 6 meters struck the bottom of the hull because the list was so severe. By 2:20 p.m., all power was lost. Anti-aircraft guns fell silent and dropped into the sea. At 2:23 p.m., Yamato capsized. Hundreds of men were trapped inside. Others were swimming in the water when the suction pulled them back toward the ship. As the roll reached approximately 120 degrees, one of the bow magazines exploded. The blast was equivalent to thousands of tons of explosives detonating simultaneously. The resulting fireball and mushroom cloud rose 6 kilometers into the sky. Crewmen on the surviving Japanese destroyers, which were racing away from the scene, saw the cloud and knew Yamato was gone. American pilots, some of them still over the target area, were stunned by the size of the explosion. Several planes were damaged by the shockwave. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but debris and a spreading oil slick. Of the 332 men aboard, only 277 survived. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, the task force commander, and Captain Kasaku Aruga Yamato's commanding officer, both chose to go down with the ship. The 4 surviving destroyers rescued what survivors they could and returned to Japan. Operation Tengo was over. It had lasted less than 36 hours from departure to destruction. The death of Yamato was more than the loss of one ship. It marked the definitive end of the battleship era. For centuries, the capital ship, first ships of the line, then dreadnoughts, then battleships, had been the ultimate expression of naval power. Nations measured their strength by the number and quality of their battleships. Treaties were negotiated to limit battleship construction because they were seen as so threatening. Billions were spent designing and building them. But aircraft carriers had made them obsolete. The Yamato had been designed to fight other battleships in a decisive surface engagement. She had fired her main guns in anger exactly once at the Battle of Sama, and while she had performed well, the battle itself had been rendered moot by Japanese defeat in the larger campaign. For most of her service life, Yamato had been held in reserve because she was too valuable to risk, which meant she was too valuable to use, which meant she served no purpose. When she was finally committed to action in a last, desperate gamble, American carrier aircraft sank her without any American surface ship even coming within sight of her. The weapon system built to counter her, the aircraft carrier, had proven decisively superior. Every major navy in the world drew the same conclusion. After World War II, no nation would build another battleship. The carriers had won. For Japan, the loss of the Yamato carried profound symbolic meaning. The ship's name came from Yamato province, which historically encompassed the heartland of Japanese civilization. Yamato was a poetic name for Japan itself, synonymous with Japanese identity and spirit. When the Yamato was destroyed, many Japanese saw it as a metaphor for the destruction of Japan itself. The ship had embodied Japan's determination to resist Western domination, its faith in technology and willpower to overcome numerical disadvantages, and its belief in the warrior ethos that prized honor and courage above all else. The Yamato's final mission, sailing to certain death in a gesture of defiant sacrifice, perfectly encapsulated the kamikaze mentality that characterized Japan's final year of war. But gestures do not win wars. The Yamato died without accomplishing anything. She never reached Okinawa. She never fired her guns in defense of the homeland. She simply sailed out and was destroyed, taking over 3,000 men with her. The sacrifice was meaningless, which made it all the more tragic. Shigeru Fukudomi, chief of the operations section of the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff, later wrote that ships like Yamato were symbols of naval power that provided to officers and men alike a profound sense of confidence in their navy. Some Japanese citizens had believed that as long as Yamato could fight, Japan could not be defeated. The ship's destruction shattered that faith. The wreckage of Yamato was discovered in 1985, lying in two main pieces on the seabed 290 kilometers southwest of Kyushu, under 340 meters of water. Subsequent surveys using submersibles and remote vehicles have documented the wreck in detail. The bow section lies separated from the stern. The massive main turrets are scattered around the site, torn from their mountings by the force of the magazine explosion and the impact with the seabed. The ship's distinctive pagoda-style superstructure, once a symbol of her power, is collapsed and broken. Photographs and video of the wreck show the imperial chrysanthemum emblem still visible on the bow, a ghostly reminder of the empire the ship was built to defend. In 2015, Japanese lawmakers proposed raising the wreck and recovering the remains of crew members still entombed in the hull, but the technical challenges and costs were deemed prohibitive. The Yamato will remain where she sank, a permanent monument to naval ambition and the futility of building weapons for the previous war. In the decades since her sinking, Yamato has become a cultural icon in Japan. In 1974, Leiji Matsumoto created the animated series Space Battleship Yamato, which reimagined the warship as a spacecraft on an interstellar mission to save Earth. The series was enormously successful, spawning multiple sequels, films, and spin-offs. When brought to the United States as Star Blazers, it helped establish anime in the North American market. The appeal of Space Battleship Yamato was partly nostalgia, but also something deeper. Post-war Japan struggled with questions of identity and purpose after the catastrophic defeat. The Yamato became a symbol of redemption. A ship that had died in a meaningless gesture in 1945 was resurrected in fiction as humanity's savior. The series allowed Japanese audiences to reimagine defeat as heroic sacrifice and to reclaim a sense of masculine identity that had been shattered by the war. In 2005, on the 60th anniversary of the end of World War II, the film Yamato was released, telling the story of the ship's final mission through the eyes of her crew. The film was a commercial success, earning over 5 billion yen at the domestic box office, The Yamato Museum opened in Kure, near the site of the original naval arsenal, featuring a massive 1:10 scale model of the battleship as its centerpiece. The museum educates visitors about Japan's maritime history while giving special attention to the ship that has become synonymous with both Japanese naval power and the tragedy of the war. The story of the Yamato raises uncomfortable questions that extend beyond naval strategy and technology. It is a story about hubris, the belief that superior engineering and fighting spirit could overcome numerical inferiority. It is a story about sunk costs, the Japanese refusal to commit Yamato to battle, when doing so might have made a difference because they had invested too much in her to risk losing her. It is a story about fighting the wrong war, designing a weapon system for a type of battle that was already obsolete, then being unable or unwilling to adapt when reality proved otherwise. And ultimately, it is a story about the human cost of strategic miscalculation. Over 3,000 men died on Yamato's final voyage. They were sailors who had trained for years, who had families waiting for them, who knew they were sailing to their deaths, but went anyway because duty and honor demanded it. Some historians argue their sacrifice was noble. Others argue it was a waste of life ordered by commanders who should have surrendered rather than sending men on suicide missions. Both views can be true simultaneously. The men who died on Yamato were courageous. The mission they died on was pointless. Today, when naval analysts study the Yamato, they see not just a ship, but a cautionary tale. Militaries must design weapons for future conflicts, not past ones. Technological sophistication cannot compensate for strategic obsolescence. Symbols of power must be used to have value, but using them requires accepting the risk of losing them. And perhaps most importantly, wars are won by adapting to new realities, not by clinging to old certainties. The Japanese built Yamato to fight a decisive surface battle against American battleships. That battle never happened. Instead, the ship spent most of the war doing nothing, then died in 2 hours under attack by aircraft. The Americans, meanwhile, built Essex-class carriers at a rate of nearly 1 per month and trained pilots far faster than the Japanese could shoot them down. The Americans adapted to the new reality of carrier warfare. The Japanese did not, or could not. The Yamato was magnificent, but magnificence without utility is merely decoration. On April 7, 1945, the largest battleship ever built capsized and exploded, taking over 3,000 men with her and marking the end of an era. The age of the battleship was over. The age of the aircraft carrier had begun, and Japan, which had pioneered carrier warfare at Pearl Harbor, had nonetheless lost the war because it never fully committed to the implications of its own innovation. The Yamato died because she was built to fight the wrong war. That remains the final lesson of her story, as relevant today as it was 79 years ago, when the mushroom cloud rose over the East China Sea, and the last of the great battleships disappeared beneath the waves.